Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week by my colleague, Bill Roggio.
Hello, everyone.
We know it's a difficult time right now with the coronavirus pandemic still spreading across the planet. We hope that all of our listeners, all of you, are as safe as possible and that you and your loved ones are as healthy as possible. Hopefully this podcast can be something of a distraction from the pandemic for you. Though, as you should know by now, we don't cover any happy topics. This is not cheery time on Generation Jihad Radio here. And this week sort of illustrates the point. We're going to talk about ISIS, and in particular the state of the former so-called Caliphate. We are also going to discuss some history, including events that Bill witnessed firsthand in Iraq when he was embedded there years ago. Many years ago now, Bill, right? I mean, this is amazing how long ago this is now that you were there. In any event, it's been more than a year since ISIS lost the last ground it controlled. In March 2019, the U.S.-led coalition announced the liberation of Baghouz in eastern Syria. It was in this last ramshackle town that ISIS made its last stand as a territorial caliphate. Of course, the end of this caliphate wasn't the end of ISIS. The group fights on today as an insurgency. Indeed, ISIS quickly basically transformed itself or reverted to its insurgent roots throughout Iraq and Syria, with its men returning to the remote deserts and mountain areas from which they came. ISIS isn't close to the pinnacle of the power it held in either Iraq or Syria today, of course, but the jihadists claim multiple attacks across both countries each and every week. In fact, we download their claims and try and verify them with independent media all the time. There's quite a staggering amount of operations still occurring. In any event, ISIS has continued to wage jihad now under its new leader, a man known as Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qureshi. ISIS hasn't provided very many biographical details concerning its new Emir of the Faithful, but we know that this new Abu Ibrahim replaced Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was killed in October of last year in a U.S. raid in Syria. The U.S. government has identified Baghdadi's successor as a veteran Iraqi ideologue, who's also known as Haji Abdullah, and his writings have been used to justify ISIS's atrocities, including against the Yazidis in Iraq. Outside of Iraq and Syria, ISIS still has multiple so-called provinces, all of which are still loyal to Abu Ibrahim, aka, according to the U.S. government anyway, Haji Abdullah. These were originally intended to be territorial extensions of the Mother Caliphate. In many of these areas, however, the provinces control little to no territory. Most of them are nothing more really than terrorist outfits, but still they're capable of carrying out an awful lot of violence each and every week. In alphabetical order, we were going through this, and I'm sure I missed some, but ISIS has a presence in all the following nations or geographic areas. Just think about this. Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Central Africa, East Asia, meaning the Philippines, Kashmir, the Khorasan, meaning Afghanistan and parts of the surrounding countries, Libya, Pakistan, the Sinai, Somalia, Tunisia, West Africa, and Yemen. And again, I'm probably missing some, but I think you get the point. ISIS is still a worldwide network more than a year now after losing the last bit of territory in its so-called caliphate. This week, we're going to focus on Iraq in particular. Bill, my longtime colleague here, did multiple embeds in Iraq, and it's out of Iraq that ISIS grew and it mushroomed into the international caliphate. He embedded there multiple times, witnessing how the jihadis were laying the groundwork for their caliphate. So, Bill, when were you in Iraq, and what did you see in general?
Yeah, Tom, so I actually did 5 embeds in Iraq, and an embed is where you get your press credentials, and then you put yourself in with a military unit. Between 2005 and 2008, I did 5 embeds in Iraq. I was in just about all areas of Iraq. I've been to Mosul, I've been to Fallujah, Ramadi, on the border in Al-Qaim. I've been to Baghdad, south of Baghdad, and even Wasit province, where that was with the Georgian army, and they were dealing with the Shia terror groups at the time. So, it was a very interesting experience. I witnessed U.S. soldiers fighting alongside Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi police, what was known as the Awakening. Those were the tribal militias that rose up and fought against al-Qaeda. Some of them actually had sided with al-Qaeda very early on in the fight. Even embedded with a Kurdish military unit up in Mosul in 2008. So it was very interesting, very enlightening. One of the things I learned, one of several things that I learned, was just there were plenty of Iraqis who hated al-Qaeda, and they were willing to fight and die in the battle against these jihadists. Something that's misunderstood is the people of Iraq or any other country where jihadists come, they're on the front lines of this. They're the ones who are absorbing all of the blows. The jihadists almost hate them more than they hate us, because they're considered bad Muslims for not following Islamic law as they believe it should be followed. I've met Iraqis who had their hands chopped off by jihadists because they were smoking. This was all they would torment vegetable sellers because they put cucumbers and tomatoes side by side in the grocery cart. Of course, cucumbers being male and tomatoes being female. It was this kind of craziness that Iraqis, who were far more westernized than you would see in like Afghanistan or many other places, this is what the Iraqis had to deal with. They would hunt policemen down and kill them. They would target their families, run suicide bombers up against anyone who they disagreed with. It was a reign of terror. So, and this is all part of Al Qaeda in Iraq's state building process. It wanted to build an emirate in Iraq, and eventually Al Qaeda in Iraq became the Islamic State in Iraq, and that's long before we had ISIS or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. That's what it branded itself as.
And I guess, you brought up the point, Bill, about the jihadis being ultra puritanical when it came to their vegetables. I guess it's easy to see how they can be so strict with humans when they're willing to met out their punishments on anybody who's just handling, cucumbers and tomatoes. I mean, this is sort of the absurdity you're dealing with here. And that's something that, of course, the U.S. and its allies took advantage of, was the absurdity of this sort of ultra strict puritanical ideology that they were trying to impose on Iraqis. But let's talk about going all the way back to 2005 now, which is sort of striking. This is 15 years ago, Bill. I mean, incredible. Yeah. But let's go back to 2005 and your first embed. Where were you first embedded in Iraq?
Yeah, so I in 2005 I landed in the western Anbar province. So that would be from Ramadi on west. East of Ramadi is Fallujah and that area that is close to Baghdad. So first time out, I made it into Ramadi. To the towns of Haditha, Al-Qaim, and Habaniya in Anbar province. In this area, the Marines and some U.S. Army and U.S. National Guard units, they were battling Al-Qaeda. This was an area, by the way, everyone credits General Petraeus with designing the surge and counterinsurgency, but the military units out here really were trying to fight a counterinsurgency, and they were having success doing this. These are all key towns along the Euphrates River Valley where Al-Qaeda worked really hard to establish its caliphate. And the Marines, they were hardcore, right? So they realized we cannot cede this ground to Al-Qaeda, because if they let them sit in these towns and cities, that it would be nearly impossible for them. They'd be tied down to their bases and only be able to conduct raids, but they would have no influence amongst the Iraqi people. So in the fall of 2005, Marines launched an operation to clear and not just clear, but to establish footholds in all of these places that I had visited. I got there just before Thanksgiving, so the operation kicked off. I was actually trying to get there. I was raising money at the time.
This is just before Thanksgiving, 2005 again. For
2005,
listeners.
Correct,
right.
Yes.
Yep.
And, so I got in there just as they did the clear, and I got to watch. They actually had the elections during this time period as well. So I got to see the aftermath of this. And one of the things that I witnessed when I was there, a lot of people probably won't remember this, but the so-called Haditha massacre. And this is when a U.S. Marine convoy was ambushed in the town of Haditha. It sparked a big firefight. Marines chased after the fighters who targeted them, went into homes, and women and civilians were killed. And I've seen numbers between 15 and 24 civilians were killed. The Marines were never charged in this. I was in Haditha less than 2 weeks after this happened, and I walked that town with the U.S. Marines. I just remember one time there was a report that comes across the radio where they say there's this lime-colored Opel, which is a vehicle that was prevalent in Iraq, that's driving around, and it has 4 armed males, and we believe there's a suicide bomb in it. We actually spot the car, and instead of opening fire on it, the Marines decide to chase it, the squad that I'm with, and I'm looking at them like they're all insane. If it was up to me, I would open fire on that car and ask questions later, right? But they, car got away, and they said, well, we're going to have to let that one go. So what I had saw, and I saw this time after time, and I didn't just go in bed and talk to a journal. I made it sure I made down to the squad level and walked the streets with these guys. As a former soldier myself, I wanted to see exactly how it worked, how the Marines and how the soldiers were patrolling, what they were encountering, and how Iraqis treated them. Sure, sometimes you got the stink eye from people, but a lot of times I saw people come up and give them information. The people in Haditha after the Haditha massacre, so-called massacre, they were not up in arms over this. There was, we did not experience hostility on the street. It was easy to move in the area. I believe that this
But
was.
who were the guys in the Opal car, Bill? Were they anybody, or were they? You said I think they said the Marines let them go, so they were obviously they weren't what they were suspected of being.
They were just described at the time as military-age males with rifles and reported to have a suicide bomb. Now, they usually you wouldn't get a report them saying across the radio, you won't hear, these are Al-Qaeda, that won't come across that way. It's not the way the military talks. But if they had a suicide bomb, I mean, look, that's Al-Qaeda's signature there in Iraq. They were the one building suicide bombs. They were the ones doing this. So if that report was accurate, they would have been Al-Qaeda. The reason for me telling that story in the context of Haditha is what I always witnessed on Embed was soldiers and Marines erring on the side of caution and not being cowboys out there. Don't get me wrong. There's instances where this has happened, but it's the exception and not the rule. And the media made Haditha be the rule and not the exception.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the caution that you witnessed in the battlefield. And, just several months before you arrived in Iraq, of course, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was then Osama bin Laden's right-hand man and the number 2 in al-Qaeda, was warning Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was leading al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time, that he wasn't being cautious enough. Of course, there's this infamous letter that Zawahiri sent to Zarqawi in July of 2005, I think it was, the summer of 2005, in which he, dresses down Zarqawi basically for his indiscriminate slaughter of Shiite civilians and others. Basically these are actions that Zawahiri thought and Al-Qaeda senior leadership thought could actually, lead to a loss of popular support for their jihad in Iraq. And it's interesting, that letter got a lot of play, but I always come back to the fact that there are parts of that letter that have not gotten a lot of play, including that Zawahiri set out his and Al-Qaeda's incremental goals, as he called them. That's his words for the jihad in Iraq. And the ultimate goal, according to Zawahiri, was to establish an Islamic authority or emirate and then develop and support it until it achieves the level of a caliphate, governing over as much territory as Zarqawi's men could conquer. Now, those are his words, establish an Islamic authority or emirate, which would ultimately achieve, quote unquote, the level of a caliphate. And I always come back to this because, when ISIS emerged in 2014 and declared its caliphate, a lot of people acted like that was something brand new or came out of nowhere, or that wasn't something Al-Qaeda was all about or interested in. And yet we have a whole just sort of string of correspondence back and forth between Al-Qaeda senior leadership in Iraq, public statements by Al-Qaeda senior leadership saying this is what they're interested in all the time. And basically what Zawahiri and others were worried about with Zarqawi's actions was he was going to alienate the popular support needed to build the Islamic Emirate, to make an emirate that was stable. And Zawahiri actually pointed to the Taliban's Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan, which was toppled in 2001. And Zawahiri said, look, the people of Afghanistan didn't rally to the Taliban side in 2001. We want to make sure that doesn't happen in Iraq when the U.S. and its allies try and destroy inevitably any Islamic State they build there. And of course, this sort of tension, there has always been this tension there between the two, between the Al-Qaeda senior leadership vision of what they want their jihad to look like and what the jihadists in Iraq were doing. Al-Qaeda, of course, pursues a more popular revolutionary model over the long run, whereas ISIS had sort of a top-down authoritarianism. And Bill, I remember this too. You were talking about you were there just before Thanksgiving in 2005. One of the things that came out too over time was this letter from one of bin Laden's lieutenants, Atiya Abdel Rahman. He sends a letter to Zarqawi in late 2005, and in that letter, he basically it's just filled with condescension for the Jordanians. Zarqawi is, of course, a Jordanian, and it's filled with condescension for him. And he even suggested Zarqawi consider stepping down. I mean, that's sort of amazing to see that sort of thing in action while you're talking about being there on the ground in Iraq with Marines who are trying to stop these suicide bombers from killing mainly Iraqis, but others as well. you could see that Al Qaeda senior leadership that early on in 2005 knew that there were major problems here.
Yeah, and Tom, Al Qaeda Central was right to be concerned about Zarqawi's heavy-handedness in Iraq. One of the I believe it was either the first or second night of my embed out there. I was waking up and we went in the middle of the night. We walk about 2 miles in the town. We're on Al Qaim. This is a town right on the border with Syria. I mean, you could literally look across the border and see Syria. We're ushered a squad of Marines, about 8 to 12 Marines, and we hike about 2 miles to this home, and I'm sitting there going, what the hell is happening here? We get in there, we take our boots off, and then we're with this group of tribal leaders. And they're telling us, I hated taking my boots off, by the way, because if something went bad, I'd got to get my boots off and run. But the tribal leaders are telling us, about Al Qaeda, how heavy-handed they're being, how they don't want to be part of this, how they need to get rid of them, how they're willing to fight against Al Qaeda. This was the very beginning of the awakening, and my understanding, it could have been one of the first meetings with Iraqi tribal leaders in order to establish this type of relationship. I was surprised. Usually this type of mission would be carried out with special forces. I was shocked that the Marines were tasked with this mission. So it was just a lieutenant and, like I said, a handful of Marines and I just marching out into the middle of nowhere to go talk to them. And it's very, very dangerous for these tribal leaders to even meet us. That's why it had to be done at 2:00 in the morning. Why we had to sneak around the city of Al Qaim, or really a town of Al Qaim, in order to do this. And so this is what Zawahiri and Rahman and others feared about Zarqawi's tactics.
So, just as a side note, do you know what happened to that tribal leader over time that you met with?
I don't know what happened to the tribal leader. I don't know whether he was killed or survived. I do know that tribe remained a steadfast ally of the U.S. up until the U.S. withdrawal. They formed something called the Anbar Tigers, and it was like some type of border patrol unit. But I not individually know, but historically, a lot of the tribal leaders who were very public about this were targeted, and some were killed by Al Qaeda in Iraq.
And just to return to your point, it's the locals, whether they be Iraqis or Syrians or Afghans, they're often on the front line against the jihadis. And this is another case in point of that. So, dealing with all these tensions, of course, Al Qaeda in Iraq are familiar and well aware that they're having problems building support for their cause, although they do have some. But in 2006, we're going to now go from 2005 when Bill first goes to Iraq. We're now going to go forward to 2006. And just, basically a month and a half to 2 months after you're in Iraq, Bill, of course, Al Qaeda in Iraq forms the Mujahideen Shura Council. This is in January of 2006. And they merge with several other groups under the Mujahideen Shura Council's banner. And the purpose of this was to form this political front that would build political legitimacy for the jihadist project and ultimately put an Iraqi face on the insurgency. They knew that the U.S. and its allies at this time were scrutinizing their foreign leadership. Of course, Zarqawi was a foreigner. Some of the guys underneath him were foreigners. Ultimately, however, Zarqawi is killed in June 2006. And he's immediately replaced by a guy known as Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, who's an Egyptian who had served under Ayman al-Zawahiri and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. I always think when you go back to the history of this, Abu Hamza's role is probably the least reported or understood in terms of developing what becomes known as the Islamic State, because it's on his watch that in October 2006 that the Mujahideen Shura Council is relaunched as the Islamic State of Iraq. And they name this murky figure, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, as its leader. And Abu Omar was there's not a lot known about him. Of course, there are biographies that come out years later that say that he was a real guy out the whole time. The U.S. claimed at the time that he didn't even really exist, that he was just some sort of stand-in the jihadis needed to put an Iraqi face on their cause. But in any event, Abu Hamza swears his allegiance to Abu Omar. And in his oath to Abu Hamza's oath to Abu Omar, he says that basically he's recognizing that Baghdadi's supposed ancestry going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad's Quraysh tribe. Now, why is this interesting? Well, ISIS has continued with that tradition all the way through right now in 2020. So we're talking about an event that occurred all the way back in October and November of 2006. where they declare this leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, this murky figure, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. They say he's descended from the same tribe as the Prophet Muhammad. They're still claiming that today, right, Bill? I mean, all the way back into now 2019, 2020, when we have Abu Ibrahim is the new leader of ISIS, and he claims to have been descended from the tribe as well.
That's correct. It's the cornerstone to their claim to power for the Caliphate.
Right, and I don't see any information warfare or just general information reporting on the U.S. side or ally side to draw this into question, to say, this is kind of specious. The current emir of ISIS, there's some question about whether or not he could really even be descended from the Prophet's tribe, although I think there's multiple scenarios in which he could be. But, the U.S. government says he's an Iraqi of Turkmen heritage. Certainly it's dubious, but certainly ISIS hasn't proven it, but the Americans and our allies haven't really drawn it into question either. Not in sort of a integral sort of continuous way that sort of questions them on a communications basis. In any event, the timing of the announcement of the Islamic State of Iraq in late 2006, October 2006, it may have caught Al-Qaeda senior leadership by surprise. Certainly, Ayman al-Zawahiri years later says that it did. That this is something that the jihadis in Iraq were forced to do for political circumstances. But I've also always thought it was interesting, Bill. I was recently going back through all the messages on Iraq, and on the 5th anniversary of 9/11 in September 2006, Ayman al-Zawahiri, so this is just 1 month before the Islamic State of Iraq is announced, Ayman al-Zawahiri gives a lengthy interview in which he explains that the quote-unquote general concept that he's talking about now for the jihadis, their quote-unquote general concept was to establish, quote, an Islamic emirate in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And then he said that these emirates would then serve as, quote-unquote, the launching pad for the defense of Islam and Muslims and a step toward the revival of the Caliphate. So again, here's Al-Qaeda senior leadership saying, just before the Islamic State of Iraq is declared in Iraq, that what Al-Qaeda is all about, what they're trying to do is build an emirate in Iraq and build an emirate, restore basically the Taliban's emirate in Afghanistan, and then they want to use both of these to revive the Caliphate. That's sort of the working model at the time. Right, Bill?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, again, this gets lost. I mean, the Islamic State was really nothing new under the sun. It just wrapped it real nice and in a very effective military operation.
Yeah, they built on this long-standing idea. When the Islamic State emerges in 2014, they're building on these years of Al-Qaeda saying this and the jihadis in Iraq saying this, that the caliphate's coming, that we're fighting for a caliphate. And this is lost in sort of a lot of the discussion. And it's interesting, too, because, as Al-Qaeda senior leadership is defending the Islamic State of Iraq publicly in both private and public correspondence, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So then you return to Iraq just within 2 months of them declaring the Islamic State of Iraq. You go to Fallujah, right, Bill, in late 2006?
Right, yeah. So in Fallujah, it was December 2006. This is probably the darkest time in Iraq. This is the time when there was significant pressure for President Bush to withdraw from Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was now the Islamic State in Iraq, it controlled a significant amount of territory in the country. In Nineveh province up north, where Mosul,
which is where Mosul is, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in Salahuddin, which is just south of it, in Anbar province, in and around Baghdad, in Diyala province, and in the east, which borders Iran, they controlled large areas of Iraq by this point. The Iraqi military was incapable of defending large areas. It was hunkered down on its bases. It was ill-developed. They were pushed out too fast, and they were butchered by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So in Fallujah, I was there 1 year after the Battle of the Fallujah, okay, just a little over 1 year. At that point in time, that was actually the second Battle of Fallujah. The city was walled off, access was restricted, there was sort of zones set up in the city, so they were trying real hard to get, you had to have photo ID to move in and out of the city. The U.S. military, Iraqi police, Iraqi army were working really hard to try and secure Fallujah, but it was a tough task. Remember, I mentioned that in Anbar, the military was actually practicing counterinsurgency, right? The counterinsurgency. But
I think the whole point of counterinsurgency is to not be counter-Fallujah.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't being practiced nationwide. So whatever was working in Anbar can easily be degraded from the outside. It's almost like, think of it like Afghanistan and the border, and having Pakistan being a sanctuary for the Taliban. It's that similar. While things in Anbar, though, things were going right, it was constantly disturbed by what was happening in the provinces surrounding Anbar province. So I was embedded with the police transition team. So what this was a group of Marines, pretty much like 10 to 20 Marines who were embedded with the Iraqi city police. We were at the provincial compound. The police were basically under siege. We took mortars there almost daily. There'd be drive-by shootings at the provincial center where we were stationed. Outside of the police had to hide their faces. If anyone got wind who the police were, they would target them or target their families. It was, Fallujah was under nominal control of the Iraqi government and the U.S. military. While I was there, I was also embedded with regular Army unit, the military transition teams, and regular U.S. Army, or actually U.S. Marine units in Fallujah. It was surreal. I got to tell you. I mean, I didn't witness the first or second battle of Fallujah, but what I witnessed while I was in Fallujah in December 2006, it was very dark. It was very clear that the police, the Army, and the U.S. military had a very thin grasp on security. But again, what you did see is that Iraqis were willing to take that risk. Al-Qaeda was targeting their families, was targeting them personally, attempting to enforce Sharia. And one interesting thing I noted when I was there were some Iraqi units. When I was out in patrol with the military transition teams, so you would be with it'd be like me, 2 Marines, and maybe a squad or 2 of Iraqi soldiers. So you think about that, it's a little scary, right? But a lot of these army units were Shia, were from so you to over there's the Shia sect in Islam and the Sunni sect, and there's problems between. I'm not going to go all into the detail there, but there's a lot of distrust. Anbar is a primarily Sunni area,
and of course,
Shia military.
And Bill, of course, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then the Islamic State of Iraq and ISIS, they have a fetish for Shiite blood.
Absolutely. Them being Sunni
Shiites,
themselves,
yeah.
and they hate the Shia, and part of Zarqawi's problem was going after the Shia. So I would see people come up to the Shia Iraqi military officers and provide intelligence. And if the U.S. military didn't want to do the targeting, these guys would go out and do it on their own. So they were maybe a little extrajudicial killing in a dirty war in a place like Fallujah. Sometimes a little of that is necessary to make things happen. One interesting thing, that was always in the back of my mind. Remember that Fallujah was the center of the rise of Al-Qaeda. And Abu Hamza al-Mujair, Zarqawi's successor, he supposedly served as a lieutenant to Zarqawi in Fallujah at one point. This would have been in the early days when the uprising in Fallujah, when Al-Qaeda was enforcing Sharia and they kicked out the Iraqi army and the U.S. military. So Fallujah was a very well-known turf for Mujair and Al-Qaeda in Iraq in general.
All right, so we're going to take a break there. That brings you up through 2006. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Islamic State of Iraq and how it evolved into ISIS from 2007 onward.
Hey everyone, thanks for being a listener of Generation Jihad. We're really excited to be able to bring this show to our dedicated audience. Our research and products like these are made possible because of your donations. We want to do more of this and bring you more and more new products. So if you like what you hear, or if the research on our website has been helpful, consider donating to support our work today. Just head on over to longwarjournal.org and click the donate button in the top right. We'd really appreciate your support. With that out of the way, let's get back into the episode.
Okay, so Bill, you're in Fallujah in late 2006. Now we're going to move forward to 2007. You're in Iraq again in 2007, covering the surge of American forces. Where were you in Iraq during that time, and what did you see?
Yeah, so I actually was in Iraq at two different times in 2007. In January 2007, I was embedded with a military transition team in Habaniya. This was prior to the surge actually kicking off. And that was quite interesting. This was in an area that was along the Euphrates River Valley that was an Al Qaeda stronghold. And what I witnessed there was these awakening groups going after Al Qaeda in Iraq, right? They had a target list. And when I was there, I may get these numbers wrong, but they pulled off like number 7, number 15, and number 19 off of their 20 most wanted list. So it was pretty interesting to see. That was a short embed with a Marine unit there. And then in September 2007, when the surge was raging, I guess the surge began in the spring of that year. I was embedded.
And so Bill, tell listeners again what the surge is. This is so long ago now. People probably even forgotten exactly what went down. I mean, most people will remember.
Yeah, no, Tom, it's 13 years ago, right? I mean, it's hard to believe that that it was that long ago. It feels like another lifetime, or at least another professional lifetime ago. So the surge, right? At this point in time, as I explained earlier, Al Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State in Iraq, controlled significant territory throughout multiple provinces in Iraq. They were dug into these areas. The Iraqi security forces were getting beaten down every time they tried to go in and dislodge them. Al Qaeda in Iraq was launching suicide attacks, major suicide attacks, like doing things like taking oil tankers and detonating them in Sadr City, a Shia area in Baghdad, and killing 100 people at a time. You had the Shia death squads responding by butchering Sunnis in Baghdad. So at this point, Iraq was in almost full civil war mode, with a terrorist group controlling significant territory in the country. So the surge was designed to basically beat down Al Qaeda's military capabilities, take down, remove it from control of territories, get the U.S. military and Iraqi forces into those areas, and then provide governance in these areas. It was done in stages, so they would work from area to area, usually province to province. So the first priority was securing Baghdad, and they branched out from there. And then they moved on into the surrounding provinces. Anbar was actually an easy one to do. Most of Anbar was actually pretty secured by the time the surge happened, and then they moved into Salahuddin and Diyala, which was a very bloody fight, went underreported. And then the last area was Nineveh province and Mosul itself. So, in 2007, September 2007, actually, that's when we launched the actual Long War Journal as well. I remember programming the website as I'm walking out the door to get that up, so we can be the Long War Journal while in Iraq. And there I was primarily in Baghdad, some areas south of Baghdad, including that area that's known as the Triangle of Death, and also spent a short amount of time with the Georgian army in Wasit province, and they were providing security against the Shia terror groups that were operating in that area. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother episode, Tom.
So while this is all going on, while you're embedded there in Iraq again in 2007 a couple times, of course, Al-Qaeda is weighing in about what's going on in Iraq, as it did throughout this whole period. And interestingly enough, you have a lot of people who claim that the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006 was sort of the end of Al-Qaeda's presence in Iraq. ISIS itself made this claim repeatedly when Al-Qaeda senior leadership disowned it in 2014. It was the spokesman of ISIS and its predecessor organizations, Abu Muhammad al-Anani, a fire breather really for the organization. He tried to claim that this was the case, although I think his testimony was deeply conflicted on this point and contradictory. I think most of what he said actually hurt his case. That's a future episode, but this podcast, we'll get into all that. But in any event, throughout 2007, months after the Islamic State of Iraq was formed, interestingly enough, Al-Qaeda senior leadership continued to defend the Islamic State of Iraq, both publicly and in private. And we have collected a number of speeches and private correspondence that was found in Osama bin Laden's Abbottabad compound and other pieces of evidence to show what they were thinking. And again, it was a July 2007 speech where Ayman al-Zawahiri weighed in on this and described the Islamic State of Iraq as a big leap on the road of jihadi action in Iraq. And he defended Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, who was then basically the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and had sworn his allegiance to this murky figure known as Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. And Zawahiri says that Abu Hamza and his comrades had built this Islamic State, which was one step closer to the outskirts of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Caliphate. So again, you have Al-Qaeda weighing in, saying, basically, out of Iraq, we're going to build, the Caliphate is coming. That's not just something they were saying publicly. Bill and I, for years, we fought to get the Bin Laden files released. This is the massive tranche of documents that were recovered in Bin Laden's Abbottabad compound when he was killed in May 2011. We're going to have a couple different episodes on that in the future, Bill. I know we're working on that. I have some good ideas on that. Well, what's interesting is some of these letters that have been released show that Al-Qaeda was very concerned about the Islamic State of Iraq's jihadi critics, including bigwig, heavyweight ideologues like Dr. Hamid al-Ali. Well, Dr. Hamid, who was in Kuwait, is a Kuwaiti. He's a U.S. designated terrorist. He's somebody who the U.S. government has accused of financing al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Ali didn't back the Islamic State of Iraq. Dr. Hamid actually was a very loud critic of it and actually called for its dissolution. And so it was in August 2007, in one of the letters that we've analyzed that's been released, Bin Laden actually says to Zawahiri, he's instructing Zawahiri, he says, look, basically the most important thing we need to do right now is remove the ambiguity around the subject of the Islamic State of Iraq. Those are Bin Laden's words. He wanted to remove the ambiguity. And what he wanted Zawahiri to do was make basically the Islamic State of Iraq the centerpiece of his public testimony. And he told Zawahiri that he wanted, and this is a quote now, that he wanted Zawahiri to make this the quote-unquote main access for your work plan in the coming stage should be the continued support of the truthful mujahideen in Iraq, headed by our brothers in the Islamic State of Iraq, and defending them should be the core issue and should take the lion's share and the top priority in your speeches and statements. This is all curious, right, Bill? If the Islamic State of Iraq had truly broken off from al-Qaeda senior leadership and betrayed bin Laden, and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi was this sort of usurper of authority, as it was later claimed, then why the heck was bin Laden and Zawahiri defending him, right? And in fact, we see in all these statements, they defend Abu Omar al-Baghdadi and Abu Hamza and say that they're the righteous leaders of the jihad. Quite the opposite of what we see later with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's confused is in all of this is, yes, there was criticism from Al-Qaeda Central on the Iraq project and the declaration of the Islamic State of Iraq and how Zarqawi was going about, declaring Sharia and targeting the Shia. But that didn't mean they didn't back the project, that it didn't mean it wasn't a core goal of theirs. There was criticism of how Zarqawi operated, but that didn't mean they didn't support the Islamic State of Iraq. They absolutely did. All of the evidence points to this, and anything that says otherwise it's based on feeling and not fact.
Well, it's interesting too. We were covering all of the Islamic State of Iraq videos at the time. They would come out, we'd watch them, and a lot of them were framed in an Al-Qaeda context where they have Al-Qaeda leaders at the front end or the back end or sort of interspersed throughout. There was a lot of Al-Qaeda commentary, citing Osama bin Laden, citing Ayman al-Zawahiri and others. So it wasn't like the Islamic State of Iraq was saying, hey, we're out of the Al-Qaeda fold now and forget you. We're not going to have anything to do with you. I can cite, a lot of videos and statements that came out from the Islamic State of Iraq that certainly looked like they were still referencing it from an Al-Qaeda point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I can... This is just one of those issues. I know, Tom, I constantly, when we discuss this, I'm like, I just don't understand the debate over this. To me, the debate is over. A
lot of it's framed in the post-2014 world, where people, part of what I've found out through doing this for years is that ISIS generated a lot better analysis than Al-Qaeda did, because ISIS didn't really hide the extent of what it was doing to the extent that Al-Qaeda did. And ISIS was very in your face. But there were a lot of these bad sort of paradigms for understanding Al-Qaeda that we've sort of fought through the years. And this is one of them, that basically there was this big effort to say that Al-Qaeda didn't really have anything to do with the jihad in Iraq, and that it wasn't really, the Islamic State of Iraq wasn't really part of the Al-Qaeda project. And I got to tell you, there's just so much evidence that cuts against that, including Al-Qaeda senior leadership's own words, that it's very tough to take that at face value, So I understand where you're coming from and why that struggle. But you know what? We'll make that another one. I keep putting these little notes. We'll make that a future episode. We'll talk about Al-Qaeda and the relations with ISIS and its predecessors. We'll make that a whole episode in the future, just going through all the evidence, and there's quite a bit of it.
Yeah, with me, Tom, you may as well be arguing that the grass is not green and the sky is not blue. We track this from the very beginning. We're familiar with all of the statements and all the communiques. It's a slam dunk case, and it's almost insulting to have to defend it.
Well, look, not to be off key here for a second, but there's a lot of crappy analysis out there.
There is.
So, this is the way it is. Anyway, we'll get into this more. Not that there weren't big problems in Iraq for Al Qaeda. Of course there
Absolutely
were. But the idea that it was the Islamic State of Iraq was totally out of the Al Qaeda fold just doesn't hold water for us. In any event, so that brings us up. Let's get back to 2008 now. So, Bill, you're in Iraq again. I'm sure your wife was loving this at this point.
Yeah, she's real happy about this. Yeah.
Yeah, and this time you're embedded in Mosul, which is the future seat of the ISIS Caliphate. I mean, this is where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi accepts his role as Caliph Ibrahim during a speech at the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri in 2014. I mean, Mosul is it from ISIS's perspective. This is the big deal for them in Iraq. Can you talk about your time there and what you saw there, sort of this early on? So this is 2008 now. 6 years later, this is the site of Baghdadi's sort of glorious ascension to power as he saw it, and you're there 6 years earlier.
Yeah, as I noted earlier, right, the surge kind of went in stages, and by 2008, the real fight against Al Qaeda, which it was beaten back again in Baghdad and in Diyala and Salahuddin. Most of the group either went underground and it went to a cellular sort of guerrilla warfare nature, or it fled to Mosul and Nineveh province, right? So this was where the real fight was, and because I'm a genius, this is where I decided to go. And
or just lucky from a historical
I'm
perspective.
saying that in the sense of
course.
If you want to catch a bullet or an IED, you went to Mosul in 2008.
Yeah.
So there I was embedded with the U.S. military transition teams. Again, those are the ones they embed themselves with the Iraqi military. This was an army unit that mentored a battalion of Iraqi troops actually it was with two different MITs, one in eastern and one in western Mosul. So it was a battleground. It was like Fallujah in 2006. There were IEDs and suicide bombs going off or shootings almost every other day. The military was hunting Al Qaeda in Iraq cells there. They were rounding up Saudis, Syrians, Libyans, Moroccans, you name it. They even were publishing org charts of these groups. I remember at the time with pictures of them. It was a lot of good hard work by the U.S. military and the Iraqi military. Up there, they had an Iraqi division. Two of the brigades in the division's about, I guess the Iraqi division's probably around 10,000, and so a brigade would be about 2,000 each. Two of those were actually Kurdish Peshmerga who were reflagged as Iraqi army. They knew the city real well, and the other two were they were Iraqi units from the outside. One of them was a Shia, and one was a predominantly Sunni unit. So
you're there in March 2008, I think.
That's correct, March 2008, and so I'll tell one story. I mean, and it's probably one of the ones that still makes the hair on the back of my neck raise. So one day we go to this place called Combat Outpost Inman. It was an Iraqi army battalion stationed in, I believe it was eastern Mosul at this time. And the Iraqi military commander there, the colonel there, he was a mess. And the Iraqi general that I was with, they were going to relieve him of command. So we go up there and we pull in. And I immediately note to them with a lieutenant colonel that I'm with, I said, why are we driving straight on the base? Now, if you haven't served in the military and served overseas, you might not understand what I'm saying. But typically, you don't want to pull right up onto a military base in a war zone. You want like a serpentine. You want to go around obstacles to slow your path. Because I'm like, wow, a suicide bomber can drive right up onto this place. And he looks at me and he says, that's why we're driving up there to relieve him. Now, they go and relieve the colonel, but they don't actually relieve him of command. They say, you got to be out of here in a couple of days. We leave. 2 days later, I remember in the morning, we hear a massive explosion. I'm probably about a mile away from this base. I'm on the major FOB, the major forward operating base at the airport in Mosul at this time. It shook the trailer that I'm in. I come out and I see a mushroom cloud. And, oh shit, right? It's what happened here. I get with the MITs who are around the corner, the military transition team guys. We put our gear on, roll up. It's at Combat Outpost Inman. Al-Qaeda's suicide bomber packed a dump truck and armored it. They welded plates in spots. that the ID, the counter IED team that was at the scene, they said that at least 10,000 pounds of explosives. So at that point in time, the largest suicide bomb detonated in Iraq. It looked like, so the guy runs through the gate. They had an ambulance block it. The dump truck goes through it, pulls in the middle of 3 buildings, and detonates. There's a crater that's about 20 feet deep and 30 feet wide. It looked like Oklahoma City times 3. The facades of all these buildings are ripped off. You could see into the rooms. You see, when by the time we get out there, they're pulling bodies of the Iraqi soldiers out. And it was horrific. And it was very sad. You see the Iraqi soldiers crying. So I'm embedded with actually at the division level with this Iraqi Army unit and the military transition team. And I turn to the general and I say to him, because this is, it's very sensitive, right? I don't want to be standing there like some schmo, combat reporter taking pictures of dead soldiers. I mean, as a former soldier myself, you have to respect this, right? So I said, sir, I don't think I can do this. And his response to me was, show them, show the world what our soldiers fight and die, and die fighting Al Qaeda. Show how horrible Al Qaeda is. We're here to do our job. You do your job. And to me, it was probably I'm not saying it. I'm not giving it the right, but to me, it was one of the more poignant things I had heard from a military commander. I mean, there was 12 of his soldiers killed, and about I believe 20 or 30 wounded. I'm surprised that the body count was so low on this attack. And by the way, we believe that colonel who was being relieved just basically gave the keys to the kingdom to an Al Qaeda fighter to come in and detonate and conduct that attack. So that was probably one of the more jarring things. That was actually one of the last days. I believe it was the last day of the embed. It was on Easter morning that attack took place, and it was very difficult to leave that unit at that point in time. But it did. To me, it showed. The Iraqis, they continued to fight. While it was in Mosul, there was they kidnapped the Chaldean cardinal, basically a Christian cardinal. The Iraqi military units were operating night and day trying to get this. These guys, I mean, a lot of cases, look, they're not Americans. They're not going to run 24/7. In this case, they knew the importance. They eventually found him dead, but there were some committed units in there.
So the suicide bomber who blew himself up at the combat outpost there, I think you said it was on the eastern side of Mosul. Later it comes out that it's actually a former Guantanamo detainee from Kuwait, known as Abdullah Saleh al-Ajmi. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq actually then uses your photos that you took, that the Iraqis said you should take there at the combat outpost, in their propaganda videos in June 2008, sort of celebrating the sack by al-Ajmi. Why don't you talk a little bit about the photos and how they were used in the propaganda video? That could not have sat well with you, of course.
Yeah, it's one of the multiple moments in your career where that happens and you want to take a shower, and no amount of showers can wash off that stink. It's but you have to expect it, right? I was the only reporter on the scene of this. It also, Tommy, we know they follow us, so you get that creep as well. Your information has been in several Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and mine as well, and Taliban propaganda. They use our information.
Yeah, just to be clear, we do not like you. So
and we don't like you using our stuff.
No, right. And I always find it creepy when anytime we're in one of these guys' publications. So, but yeah, totally.
Yeah,
but, it's always disturbing. But al-Ajmi, it's interesting because I think this is one of those stories where it's one of the first times you and I were talking about who a guy was, because I was building this huge database of Guantanamo detainees at the time, both current and former, based on leaked and declassified information. And we went through al-Ajmi's files, and I remember seeing that the U.S. authorities initially, anyway, he admitted that he had actually fought for the Taliban in the front lines in Bagram for months in 2001. And then basically he tries to walk that back at one point in one of his hearings at Guantanamo, but the U.S. authorities don't believe him. They basically concluded that he deserted the Kuwaiti army to wage jihad in Afghanistan, which is obviously it's a sign of ideological commitment, right, Bill? And then, you have the Kuwaitis. Kuwaitis fought to repatriate. The Kuwaitis fought to repatriate their citizens, including Ajmi. and he's returned to his home country in November 2005, and there you are just a few days after he blows himself up in 2008.
We know that the recidivism rate is high. These guys, they're not.
I think the bottom line for me is that you can make a lot of different arguments. I don't want to get into Guantanamo now, detention policy, because that's a whole mess. So I don't want to get into any of that. But the bottom line is that a guy like Al-Ajmi with the Kuwaitis, I mean, they were pressuring to let him out, and then they didn't keep tabs on him, and they didn't stop him from going into Iraq and doing this. And that's mainly my main point with it, is you can't have it both ways. You can't say, hey, you got to free our citizens, and then don't take responsibility for making sure these guys aren't committed fighters. And the thing about his dossier is, I mean, if you're going to desert the Kuwaiti military and go off to wage jihad in Afghanistan, that shows a level of commitment that's probably not, you got to make sure you're doing something to make sure that is sort of mitigated going forward, and clearly they didn't. Right?
Yeah, and it gets back to a running theme that we have with a lot of this is these guys just don't retire. Ajmi, he punched his ticket, and he decided to conduct a suicide attack in Iraq. When we release Taliban leaders, they come back and they join the negotiating team or get back into be a military commander or join, so they're fighting on timelines that are so far different from ours. And it's a very disturbing aspect of this. Ajmi's attack, it's hard to say. Would Al-Qaeda in Iraq been able to recruit someone else to conduct these attacks? The answer is probably yes. But the fact is that this guy should not have carried out that attack.
Yeah, and he jumped to the head of the line on that day to do it.
So, that he did. He wanted to do this.
There were hundreds and hundreds of others who did it as well. And, of course, ISIS became the most prolific martyrdom machine on the planet at one point. But let's go through this now. So now you leave Iraq in 2008. Of course, from 2008 to 2010, the U.S. continues to hunt down Islamic State of Iraq leaders. In April 2010, they get both Abu Umar al-Baghdadi and Abu Hamza al-Muhajir. The U.S. military at the time, I remember covering this, they were saying that, this was a sign of, that they're really weakened and they're probably on the path to defeat, so to speak. We hear that over and over again. But then in 2011, President Obama, under his watch, and it's certainly something he campaigned on, all American forces were withdrawn from the country. And in our view, I know, Bill, we've been covering this for so long, our view is that withdrawal combined with the war in Syria, combined with the sectarian politics in Iraq, which were entirely poisonous, they sort of created an opening for the Islamic State of Iraq, not only to survive, but even to mushroom and eventually become the so-called Caliphate. And I remember you and I were talking about this in 2011, 2012. A lot of people in Washington and elsewhere were celebrating the fact the U.S. wasn't in Iraq anymore, where, we just watched the jihadis. That's what we do. And we didn't think the jihadis were finished at the time. I remember we co-wrote a piece in 2012 called Strategic Retreat. The main gist of it was there were basically plenty of warning signs coming out of Iraq that this thing was percolating once again, and that, basically that they were far from defeated. Now, I don't think we ever foresaw the entire rise of ISIS. There's a lot that we could not have foreseen. We don't have crystal balls here. But, based, Bill, on what you saw during your embeds in Iraq, it wasn't hard to envision that the Islamic State of Iraq could rebound pretty quickly in 2010 onward, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. When I was in Mosul, I realized that there was still a very long fight ahead. We achieved a lot of tactical successes in Mosul, in Anbar, in Saladin, in Baghdad, and other places. But it was very clear to me that the 2011 withdrawal was premature. As we argued at the time, we lost entire intelligence networks in Iraq. The awakenings that we created, and it wasn't just in Anbar. These happened throughout Iraq. We lost contact with these networks. These were the networks that could have warned us about the rise of the Islamic State. During my time in Iraq, I saw how we effectively hunted down one terrorist leader after another, but they always seemed to have a replacement. And that's because they were operating in battlefields beyond Iraq and pulling them in. Syria, even before the Syrian civil war, Syria served as a sort of Pakistan for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We even conducted a cross-border raid. I believe it was in, 2008?
Well, the U.S. did, not you and me, Bill, right?
Yeah, yes, that would not be me. That would be the U.S. military. And went after a guy named Abu Ghudayah, who was running an Al-Qaeda network that was feeding this insurgency. look, this told me they had developed a deep bench of talent, and that they can keep this insurgency going indefinitely. Particularly, they could keep this going indefinitely without U.S. support. The Iraqi military, the Iraqi police, they were getting better, but they lacked a lot of what was needed to take this fight. The intelligence gathering and reconnaissance and combat support and medical and all the things you need to keep a military in the field and hunting for jihadists. They weren't real good at that. They needed us for that. So after the withdrawal, from 2011 onward, we continued to track the Islamic State of Iraq and their attacks. And it was obvious from their pace of operations that the threat was rising. One of the things that the Islamic State of Iraq was doing was they were attacking prisons, right? This was it was important for several reasons. One, their messaging is always with the prisoners is, we will not forget you. We will do our utmost to free you. They attacked one prison in Mosul that I was at in 2008 and freed hundreds of prisoners. They did it in Baghdad. They did it in Anbar. They did it in Salahadin. So they were replenishing their ranks. Then you had the Syrian civil war starting to take shape, a very weak border. So, you and I, we're looking at this and we had a lot of concerns. There were
we were watching the number of weekly attacks was spiking all throughout 2012. At a time when a lot of people were spiking the football and the fact that the U.S. wasn't there anymore.
Yeah, so. I remember, Tom. Do you remember we did a debate over at the Center for New American Security with Peter Bergen?
It's just New America. Yeah,
New America Foundation. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. And he told us, Bill, you were in Iraq. You saw that they're defeated, and our response was, that was 2008. This is 2011. Are you watching what's happening?
2012.
Yeah, it was 12. Right. It was just before the Islamic State rose. So, we were very much on the record for stating that there is something serious going on. And there was one incident that really got our hackles up. And this was in the summer of 2012. The Islamic State went on a rampage in Haditha. That's the town I was embedded with in 2005. The Islamic State, they published this video for all of us to see. And what you saw was they had a bunch of Iraqi military vehicles, Humvees, pickup trucks, loaded with Islamic State fighters in military gear. And they overrun the town. They kill the police chief. They overrun the police station. They chase the military out, and they hold on to the town for for several hours throughout the evening, and then they just melt away into the desert. And we looked at that and said, what the hell was that? And it was very clear that they were practicing their operations. We had also, prior to this time, we were tracking Islamic State training camps in the deserts as well. And you would see guys, a lot of them going through doing the military drills. And a lot of people look at that and laugh and go, ha, ha, ha. Oh, they're sloppy. Well, guess what? They were good enough to overrun Haditha. And then within a year, they overrun Fallujah and then much of Anbar province. And then, lo and behold, by June 2014, they're overrunning Mosul and Kirkuk and Tikrit and Ramadi and a whole slew of towns and cities, and they control about a third of Iraq. And it was something I feel like we were sounding the warning bells. No one would listen. Everybody was pleased as punch that the U.S. withdrew. We ended the endless war in Iraq, but guess what? The Islamic State of Iraq didn't end their war. They had a war across the border that they were able to capitalize, that they were able to recruit, and they were able to reconstitute their networks and take on a weak Iraqi military and a weak Iraqi police and a fractured Iraqi government. And they were able to achieve what no one thought they would ever be able to achieve.
And, it's so maddening to see people now. They talk about the endless war rhetoric, and they act like the same crowd didn't get their way previously in Iraq, because of course they did. I mean, it's not like they didn't. It's not like this vision of the world wasn't put in place. The U.S. can leave from everywhere, right? I mean, the bottom line is the jihadis are going to keep fighting, which is what we do. We keep our eyes on the jihadis, we're not driven by what the U.S. is doing necessarily. Of course, we cover it, but the bottom line is the jihadis get a vote, and they got a vote in Iraq, and the vote went the wrong way.
Yeah,
in any event.
The endless war narrative, I mean, it's it presupposes that the U.S. is starting these wars, and if the U.S. just leaves, the wars will go away, and that's not happening. The New York Times just had a great article on France's problems in the Sahel, Mali, and in the surrounding countries, and France wants to leave. Well, guess what? That war is going to continue there, too.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that it's not... The myopia here is the idea that these wars are driven by Western decision making, or what the U.S. wants, or what, sometimes you see it online. So what nefarious warmongers like us want, and this type of stuff. I mean, it's just all idiotic, really. I mean, it's stupid. The bottom line is the jihadis, as I said, and I'm repeating myself now, but they get a vote, and they've gotten a vote multiple times in the past. And hey, listen, the U.S. can withdraw from everywhere. They're going to keep on fighting. But the bottom line is, I hope from this week's episode, when we talk about the history of ISIS, you can see, of course, the future is uncertain, and again, we don't have crystal balls, but it's easy to look around the world today and see that ISIS and its so-called provinces are still capable of an awful lot of violence each day, everywhere from West Africa to Afghanistan. And in future episodes, we're going to keep continuing to discuss ISIS. We're talking about its contested, adversarial relationship with Al-Qaeda, its competition with Al-Qaeda, plus some areas where the two could possibly cooperate. We haven't gotten that today, but we'll get into that in the future. And we're going to keep tracking the former Caliphate and any new attempts by the jihadis to resurrect an Islamic empire, because that's the bottom line here, is that Iraq wasn't the only place where the jihadis have wanted to build an Islamic emirate. Of course, they want to do that in Afghanistan, as we've talked about. They want to do it in Somalia. They want to do it in Yemen. They want to do it in West Africa. All these places are in different stages of development, but they're all going to be active theaters going forward, again, whether or not the U.S., France, or whoever else is there or not. So thank you again for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we'll see you next week.